time on the BIAL Foundation Symposium, The Mystery of Time. I'm Teresa Firmino. I'm a science journalist at newspaper Público, and it's an honor to be here to host this roundtable, which is, by the way, broadcasting via streaming, so people will watch not just the scientific audience, but also a non-scientific audience. So I will have for the next 2 hours with me Professor Jimena Canales, historian of science at the University of Illinois in USA, Professor Dean Buonomano, neuroscientist at University of California in Los Angeles, Professor Wolf Singer, neuroscientist and director emeritus at Max Planck Institute for Brain Research, and Professor Joseph Takahashi, neuroscientist, chair of the Department of Neurosciences at Howard Hughes Medical Institute, and also researcher at the University of Texas. Joseph, I will start with you. You have been studying molecular clocks and the genetic basis of the circadian clocks in mammals just now for decades. In 1978, your team discovered an important gene, the clock gene, and since then, many other circadian genes have been found. Let's imagine that this scenario, that you are in a cave for, let's say, a dark cave for 1 year or so. What will happen to your circadian clocks on that scenario?
Very interesting question. So that experiment was done a few times. One that I recall was done in 1938 by Nathaniel Kleitman, one of the fathers of the field of sleep. And he went into a cave underground for almost 40 days. And what they found is that they still went through sleep-wake cycles, even though they had no clocks or time cues and no environment, no sun. But the timing of their sleep-wake cycles drifted. They didn't document exactly the time in that experiment. That was done many years later by actually recording people's sleep-wake cycles. And what was important is they persisted. We still have 24-hour clocks that function in the absence of the sun and in the absence of environmental cues. Now this was, I don't know if you want me to go on, but this was studied systematically first by Jürgen Aschoff, who was a Max Planck director in Erlangen-Ondex, Germany. And he had these underground apartments. It was known as the bunker. And in those apartments, volunteers could live for a very long period of time. They could control the light. They had 24-hour meal service. I think they're only allowed 1 bottle of beer a day, though, on average. But they measured body temperature rhythms, which have a very good circadian rhythm in people. And there they could show, again, that we all have internal clocks that persist in constant conditions. Each of us is slightly different. Most of us have long clocks, longer than 24, but some of us have shorter clocks. Those are the minority. And so that was one of the beginnings of our field in the early 60s, the systematic study of human circadian rhythms.
So light is a main factor for controlling our circadian rhythm, but that's not the only one.
Yeah, so light is the major synchronizer of our clocks, there's a master clock in our brain, in the base of the brain, that responds to light. But once the genes were discovered by my lab and others, what we found is there are clocks throughout our entire body. And today we would say every cell in your body has the potential to have a clock. And those clocks don't respond to the sun directly. They're responding indirectly to cues. Many of them are nutritional or circulating in our bloodstream. And they also respond to our body temperature rhythm. which synchronizes.
You'll say that the master clock is in the brain and it responds to light, but the other several clocks, so this means other genes, I suppose, are in the cells and they're activated or not, responding to the circadian rhythm. Is that correct?
That's correct. They actually all use the same genes. The clock is actually the same. The only difference is this input signal to those clocks.
So could you describe a bit how the whole system is working or not working? In a plain language, I mean.
Yeah, the way we like to think about it is the master clock in the brain is similar to a conductor of a symphony. That master clock provides the synchronization timing for the orchestra in our body, which are all the other individual clocks. And normally, our body follows our brain because we're not traveling in a jet under normal circumstances or obviously during human evolution. And so our systems are not accustomed to rapid movement of our clocks. We can slowly adjust. And so normally the whole system is in sync. And the brain really is in charge because it's giving this timing signal like a conductor.
So, but I mean, how many, I don't know how many circadian genes are known at this point.
Yeah, we would say there are at least 6 core genes, but those are modulated by another 24 genes that we know of. And if we tried, I had to make a list recently. That list had something like 72 genes on it.
Oh,
so it's the number is growing as we find more and more regulators of the system. But the core is really a handful, small number.
You said on your talk that these genes, then they control thousands of genes each day. So they turn on and then turn off thousands of genes in our cells. So the whole body is doing this turn on and turn off.
Yeah, that's one of the new, more recent realizations once we were able to look at, all the genes in the genome. What we came to realize is that the majority of our genes can oscillate. If you look at many different tissues, you'll find that in almost every tissue, one of your favorite genes might be oscillating.
You also presented on your talk interesting results on mice and how the circadian rhythms are related to health, aging, and also lifespan. Could you share with the audience those results, because they are really fascinating? And they have to do with the food restriction, and also not only that, the time we eat is very important.
Yes, thank you for the question. So what my lab has been working on for the last 5 years or so is to see, well, the field has found that the timing that you eat is very important for your metabolism. I should say, if you're a mouse, the time you eat is very important. That's what we study in the laboratory. And so if a mouse eats a Western diet, high-fat diet, at one time it becomes fat, but at another time it's protected if it eats at the correct time, which is the waking time of the mouse. That work has actually been applied to people more recently, not by our lab, but by other labs, and there is evidence that now that even time restriction for eating is beneficial for humans. This has led to a number of fad diets, which I'm sure you've read about. The 8-16 diet, which is a diet where people eat within an 8-hour window. So we would say, that there is evidence for that. What isn't clear in the fad diet is the timing of that, what we would call the phase. It matters what that 8-hour window is. Okay. So if you were on the fad diet, but you only ate between midnight and 8 a.m., that would be, in our experience, in our experiments, that would be the wrong time. What you need to do is eat when you're awake and active. And so we've applied those kinds of experiments to mice to ask whether that affects lifespan and health span. And so it's well known in the aging field that if you reduce the calories, you can extend lifespan. It's the most effective intervention for increasing lifespan. This has been shown in all animals, I would say, with the exception of humans, because the experiment is too hard to do. It takes too long. You know, we live too long to do that experiment. But in a mouse, if you reduce calories by, say, 30%, you can live 30% longer. That's a huge increase. Imagine if we lived 30% longer.
So actually, we already know how to know how interfere and know the reason why something could work or not by interfering with the circadian rhythm. That's what your results, the meaning of your results, right?
Well, what we found is that the time that the mice eat makes a huge difference in how long they live. Mm-hmm. It's a difference between 10% longer and 35% longer. Eating exactly the same food, but just at the right time.
So I don't want to make you a food advisor for us, but and you said that it's really difficult to translate this to humans. But what kind of advice you would give us? How we should respond to that?
Yeah, so for us, it's very hard to reduce our calories by 30%. That's very severe for a very long time. Mm-hmm. And so what we're testing now is the idea, can you just reduce the time that you eat and not so much the calories? And can we show a benefit of that? And if that was true, then that would be easier for all of us to adopt. Mm-hmm. Restricting the time, but not so much the calories. Okay? And so there are studies already not measuring lifespan, but measuring other health measures, glucose regulation, blood pressure, things like that. And those show that actually time-restricted eating is beneficial, even for people. And so we would say you should eat, first of all, you should still eat breakfast. And it's better to start early, but to end early. And we would also say you don't have to be so strict and restrict yourself to 8 hours. Our experiments say that 12 hours is fine. Mm-hmm. For lifespan.
So thank you. Mm-hmm. Professor Wolf, now we are still discussing the aspects of the biology of time, and actually you study the time in the brain. And you have proposed an interesting theory of the brain working as an orchestra. If I understood correctly, your theory, which is, I have to say, a bit difficult for a layperson to understand. So if a brain works as an orchestra, the number of neuron fires are important to convey and represent information about objects, but also the time itself carries information. Could you explain a bit your theory? If I'm completely wrong, so please.
No, you're perfectly right. Thank you for the question, which is, of course, a difficult one to answer. We know that the brain is a very distributed system. Many different processes occurring in many different places, and they all have to be coordinated somehow to produce behavior. Mm-hmm. And this is true both for cognition, so for the representation of the sensory environment, as well as for the orchestration of movement. You always have many, many different areas in the brain that have to be active at the same time. And I think yesterday in the talk I gave an example of how you could imagine that a concrete object in the outer world is represented inside of the brain. Mm-hmm. Because if it's a polymodal object, so an object that exists in various domains, like a barking dog, You hear the noise, you hear the barks, you can touch the fur, you have tactile information, you can see the animal, it's a visual information, and you also know where it is. So there's also spatial coordinates that you have to take care of. And all this information is conveyed by different sensory organs, from the retina, from the touch sense, from the auditory sense, and is processed in different places in the brain. Now, these places are very intimately connected among each other. They all reciprocally talk to each other. It's like a big party conversation. And the problem is that there is no conductor in the brain, no observer, no center on top of all this that would observe what's going on and then make the interpretation, this is a barking dog. And I forgot to mention there's also other centers in the brain that attach value to these sensory objects. So whether you should be afraid of the dog because it looks aggressive or whether it's a tame dog which you can huddle. So all this needs to be put together in order to generate this percept of this very dog, individual dog with its particular emotional connotation that you add. And all this has to be done without there being a place in the brain where there is a representation of this very dog. The old concepts, also proposed by Descartes, for example, was that there is such a center in the brain, because that's what you think. If you want to relate something, have it united in a single place. That is intuitively the most plausible. And Descartes actually was looking for such a place in the brain. And he asked students to go to the slaughterhouse and bring him brains. And he looked into them and looked for a singular center. Most of the brain is bipartite, it has two hemispheres. Most structures are double. So they were excluded. You needed a single center. And there are only two really prominent places in the brain. This is the hypophysis, which is a gland in the brain. And there's the epiphysis, which in humans is mainly calcified. But it has something to do with the circadian clock, for example.
Pineal gland.
Yeah, the pineal gland. And the students took these brains out of the skull of the cows, and the hypophysis usually gets disrupted because it's in own house, so it doesn't come with it unless you prepare it. So he only saw the epiphysis. And this is where he put the seat of the self, the observer in the brain, and he thought this is where everything comes together and is then coherently interpreted. Now we know nowadays this is not at all the case. So the question we are confronted with is a challenging one, is how is this highly distributed activity that is in different sensory systems at the same time, they all talk to each other, there is no conductor in that brain, there is no observer in the brain, and still you have this coherent percept. How is that possible? And there is an early saying that has to do also with, it's a little bit related to the problem of consciousness. How come that everything comes together in consciousness, is simultaneously there? And Sherrington, an old physiologist, classical, beginning of last century, he posed himself that problem and said, well, there are two ways in order to relate things with each other. One is the spatial solution of Descartes, and the other one is a temporal solution. He said it's simultaneity in the temporal dimension that makes that things are understood as belonging together, and you don't have to converge on a single place. So it's unity in time rather than unity in space. That's what he said, and I think that's a good concept.
So it's kind of a temporal code for in the brain, like a code Morse or a Morse code, or
yeah, it's not a Morse code, but there is something very peculiar, which I think is intuitively very plausible. If something happens at the same time, you tend to bind it together. It could be pure correlation, but usually we think that there is some causal binding mechanism that makes that these things occur together. Likewise, if this happens before this, you tend to establish a causal relation. And probably there's one reason that this is how the statistical contiguities in the natural world that are around us, in which we are embedded, actually functions. There is some logic in it. The cause has to come before the effect. And what is so interesting is that the learning rules that are implemented in the brain that make two neurons which are connected, let's assume there are many neurons connected to each other, but there are two out of the many that happen to be activated very often together because they respond to something which in the world also happens very often together. And during development, when neurons are very often activated together, they start to intensify their connections. They become coupled more tightly. And then translate this statistical relation of events in the outside world into stronger anatomical coupling. So they translate a temporal relation through correlation of activity of responses into an anatomical connection. And this is, as we think that the brain learns about statistical regularities in the outer world. And once you have this, you can use this in order to relate A with B, not by making it converge onto a Descartes unit, but just have those two elements be correlated in time.
So an important word is synchrony. You mentioned it.
Yeah.
on that representation.
Yes, one could call it synchrony. I got a bit careful in using synchrony because it has been challenged by many people because they are right. Imagine that this whole orchestra plays in synchrony. It's very boring and very poor information. What you want to have is that there be a rapid violin and then there be a slower tuba and so on. Okay. Still, they have to obey some temporal coordination, but you need to have a plurality of rhythms, a plurality of phase relations. So, yeah, you code relations in time. You have a spatial code as well. The two are combined. Nature takes what it gets. So
synchrony is not the best word.
Yeah.
Okay. But about your theory, it has been a bit difficult to get conclusive evidences about what your proposal. So why do you think might happen?
Because things tend, and Dean is probably the one who can answer this best. Things tend to become very complicated. See, the initial simple idea that whatever belongs together, like the various features of this bottle, they would just form a synchronous assembly somewhere in the brain. This was initial hypothesis, a simple thought. But now we learn that we have to do with networks where many elements that are responsive to particular features in the world outside are coupled reciprocally. So A talks to B, B talks to A, C talks to A and B, and they all mutually interact. And you can imagine what happens already if three bodies that have their own rhythm, like three pendula, swing and they are interacting because you coupled them with rubber somehow. So they are elastically coupled, like neurons are coupled through their connections. And this system of only three bodies, when you make it start it to swing, produces a dynamics that is extremely nonlinear, very difficult to grasp with mathematical formula. And if you go a little bit more complex, you get very quickly systems that can be chaotic. And if you have thousands of neurons that talk to each other reciprocally all the time from different sensory modalities, you get what we call a very high dimensional dynamic state. So you have not only x, y, z Cartesian coordinates, and maybe as fourth coordinate time, but you have all the possible phase relations with these many, many elements. So you get would it be okay to say it's nearly infinitely dimensional?
Nearly.
Nearly. And this creates the space in which the brain can store information, can combine information. But this is so unimaginably complex, since we are not used to think in more than 4 dimensions. For me, it's 3, but some people can think in 4 dimensions. Some quantum physicists claim they could even imagine another one. I doubt they can. So we have a problem. We have a system inside this skull that exists in a dynamic space and operates in it that we cannot intuitively grasp, because we are used to work in a low-dimensional world. The input is low-dimensional, the output is low-dimensional, but the processes that link the input to the output is extremely high-dimensional, and we have no intuition for it. Had we an intuition, I would be out of job. And this makes our work so difficult, because we have started in the beginning, when I'm an old man now, so I remember the beginning. We were very convinced, because we followed this behaviorist idea, the brain is a stimulus response machine. Let's study how the sensory information, physical stimuli are transformed in neural activity, then follow this stream of activity through the brain until we get out on the other side on the motor path. And then we thought, if we do this carefully, we will have understood how it works. Wrong, unfortunately, because now we know that the brain has the initiative. It is constantly generating hypotheses with its own dynamics. It takes a little bit of sensory information, interprets it. On the basis of its a priori knowledge, we call it predictive coding, or this knowledge we call priors. And to analyze the dynamics of this thing, and also the memory trace, to find out how it is storing all this knowledge, we would have to record from many, 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 many different neurons at the same time, analyze the dynamics. This is what we do nowadays, but we don't see anything. If you plot all these responses of the neurons on a paper sheet, you have 60 or 100 of them, and every time it fires, you make a dot. You look at it, you see nothing. Nothing that you can make sense out of it. So we need computers, we need statistical methods that downscale this to something we can again see. But I think we have the same problem as the physicists that were among us when they had to enter quantum physics world. It transcends our imagination or our intuition. And then you have abstract descriptions. And what does it help you? If I tell you that, you know, the neuron representation of this barking dog is a vector in a whatever dimensional space,
so what
does it feel like a dog?
Oh,
go ahead.
Yeah?
The depressing part is that the brain is made of these high-dimensional states, but is terrible at understanding these high-dimensional states. So that's the unfortunate part.
So what you are saying is that now it's hard to get evidences on your theory, but it's also a matter of technology, not only.
Well, it's only recently that that we have the technology in hand to really register the activity of thousands and thousands of neurons at the same time. It's mainly optical techniques, but they're also microelectrode. It's the same technology that you use in computer design. So it's thin film technology. You can record from a very large number of neurons, but still you have this problem to interpret what you see. And then you have to put it in relation to behavior, because there is a nice example, a theoretical study that has been published about 2 years ago, whether if somebody gave you a motherboard of a computer and gave you all the methods in order to record, measure simultaneously what all these currents and transistors and capacitors and resistors do, you would not be able to understand what this is good for.
So it's not only technology.
Yeah, and this is the problem. We have
Exactly.
we have behavior, and we have clinics, and we know if this part is damaged, then this function disappears. But We are at the very beginning.
So, Dean, thank you. Dean, so do you want to add anything more to the question of you will know better? Why it's so hard?
No, I don't. I disagree with him. I don't know better. But in a way, that's our job security, that no one knows. I mean, and I think this gets to, slightly deeper philosophical issue, is that the brain is made of a very sophisticated computational system, but the computational system is terrible at understanding the computational system it's made of. So I think it's a deep question of what the techniques we will need, and even to the extent that it's possible for the brain to understand itself, because as Wolf mentioned, most people accept that we don't understand at the intuitive level quantum mechanics. It just doesn't make sense. It's clearly correct, but it doesn't make sense, and that's just a limitation, a constraint of our brains. You know, at the end of the day, we are unusually smart apes, and I think we have to be a bit humble in our acceptance of what we can and we cannot understand.
Yeah, you have one of your books is precisely the brain bugs.
Yeah.
So exactly, what are the limitations and also the strengths of our brain?
So the brain is this incredibly powerful computational device. It's one of the most complex devices in the known universe, I think we can say. But it's really quite bad at some things. You know, if I ask somebody to divide 777 by 333, you know, most of us will go to a calculator. That's an incredibly easy computation, right? I mean, compared to most of everything we do, it's incredibly easy computation. So why is the brain, as sophisticated it is, so bad at that? And I think it's in part because of the hardware. The hardware is simply not made to do that. Everybody will say, oh, but we didn't evolve to do that. True, totally true. But no computer scientist or engineer would build a calculator using neurons, because it's the wrong hardware for that. So I think at the same time, in other domains now, beyond mental numerical calculations, rational decisions that are not influenced by biased decisions. So we can influence your decisions to think of things that are the wrong answer. So a common example I use in English is I say...
There we are good.
In
that field we are good. I don't know if I understand correctly what you said.
So the question is, if I can influence people we can influence each other, and we always do, to make correct or incorrect decisions. And if I ask you quickly, Teresa, what do cows drink? What pops into most people's head, I think, is milk. But that's the wrong answer. So we prime each other, and this reflects the associative architecture of the brain. As Wolf said, cows activated with milk, and we bind those two connections because of Hebbian plasticity, and then we often lead to the wrong answer. So the brain is incredibly fallible, and I think the best we can do as humans is to remember that and take that into account when we're doing science, when we're making our decisions.
So let's go back to the time question.
Okay.
Now. One of the other books you have is Your Brain is a Time Machine, and because you try to understand how we perceive the passage of time. And today you also mentioned that we are able to perceive the passage of time from milliseconds to days or weeks or so tell us a bit about how the brain is a time machine.
Well, the brain's a time machine on a number of levels, and I'm of course using this as a metaphor. The brain is a time machine in that, in many ways, if the brain had one job, at least in my opinion, and others may have different opinions, I think its main job is to predict the future, because that translates into the evolutionary currency of survival and reproduction. An animal that can predict where the food will be, where its enemies will be, where the predators will be, when the sun will rise, that translates into survival and reproduction. The brain is also a time machine because it tells time. And the brain tells time across a vast range of scales, from milliseconds in speech to days and circulunar rhythms and hibernations. What's interesting is that the brain is very different from our standard clocks, and that it has many different clocks in it. So Joe just mentioned famous experiments by Ashoff, in which he had people in a bunker and he could see the circadian clock still oscillate at a 24-hour cycle. What's interesting in those studies is that Ashraf also had people do timing tests on the 100 millisecond scale. So because Ashraf was interested in whether, if your circadian clock was off, if your timing for music or something would be off. And the answer is no, it wasn't off. So Ashraf had some of the early data on that. So clearly we have other mechanisms to tell time, and those mechanisms on the timing of seconds are more related to what Wolf was just speaking to, neural dynamics of neurons. And third point, I'll give you 4 reasons why the brain is a time machine. Third point is the brain creates the subjective feeling of time, the perception of time, which the brain always does, right? The brain creates subjective perception of color, of space, of body. And it does this wonderful, endows us with this ability to perceive the passage of time, which is, of course, an approximation of objective time. And finally, the brain, in a slightly more literal way, is a time machine in that it does allow us to engage in mental time travel. I think physicists are pretty much on board that true physical time travel is not a question that will be happening within the laws of physics. There's some people might disagree with that, but I think that's the standard view. Safe to say that. So the closest we'll ever come to true time travel is mental time travel, which basically just means thinking back in the history. Last time I met people here when we had the meetings, and that allows us to, the point of those memories of mental time travel backwards is not to reminisce, is not for nostalgia, it's to help us prepare for the future. And then we can go the other way, in which we can think and simulate potential different futures. You probably did that for this. You can think, oh, what will happen if I ask this question or this question? That's important. It's critical for all our jobs. And that ability to mentally project ourselves, or what will Joe answer, or what will Jimena answer to that? So that is a uniquely human feature that makes Homo sapiens sapient.
And I predict that if I speak to you about the brain as a time machine, that we will talk about the mental time travels, as you did.
Exactly, very predictable.
But is this a unique human feature, in your opinion? Because I think probably some people would say no.
We're a product of evolution, so almost any human cognitive ability, much as in physical ability, has some sort of precedent in the animal kingdom. So even language, things that we typically associate with humans. So there's an ongoing debate about the degree to which other animals can engage in mental time travel. What your prediction is, some people will say that other animals can also do it. The common answer there is maybe squirrels storing food or a bird building a nest. Most people don't consider that mental time travel because we view it as an innate reflex. Animals don't need to experience, they don't need social interaction to engage in those things. A bird that has the correct hormones might go build a nest, and a squirrel that never experienced winter and that lives in a warm place might also store food. But some of the best evidence, interestingly enough, for mental time travel in the animal kingdom is actually from birds. So there's scrub jays seem to have a bit of an ability to take into account the properties of objects. So they have 2 types of food sources. One is worms, one is nuts. The worms decay quickly and the nuts last a long time. And so they know that if they've stored the food and immediately go back, they go back to the worms. If they go back, but if they have to wait, they go to the nuts. So they seem to have a mental tracking of the passage of time. So I think there'll be examples of mental time travel in animals, but there's no doubt that this is a uniquely human, or human can perform mental time travel and think about the long term to a very different degree. Now, that doesn't mean we're particularly good at it. We should be a lot better than we are. So both in our personal lives and as
Could you explain better that idea, because it's interesting?
So human beings, one of the things that make us unique is we engage in an incredible amount of future-oriented activities, right? Brushing my teeth, most animals don't do that because I brush my teeth because I want to have my teeth when I'm older. And most of what we do, we work until we get money so we can retire. So most of the activities we engage in are future-oriented. And most animals have a very present-based outlook. So that's something that makes us unique. But we shouldn't take too much pride in that because we're actually quite bad at it. And many problems we have as members, as individuals and members of society are because of the lack of long-term thinking. Whether it's I didn't save enough for retirement, I don't exercise, I don't eat correctly. And of course, the big societal issue at this stage is climate change, right? So climate change is something that's particularly hard to address because it's very hard for people to feel invested in making short-term sacrifices for something that's very far into the distant future.
Oh, so that's a good example, or at least a good reason to explain why some people don't do anything about climate change, because we don't see it as a near risk that will threaten our lives.
I think, in my opinion, that's absolutely one factor, in my opinion.
Mm-hmm. So about these mental time travels, you also, because we have this ability, so we also can foresee our future, and also have this idea that we will going to die one day, and this realization could have huge implications.
Yeah,
philosophically speaking, even.
Yeah, so the brain does its best to predict the future, and evolutionarily, at some point, humans presumably, when we started building tools. The amazing thing about building a tool, and that's taken as something that's uniquely human, to me, in many ways, it's not the tool itself. It's storing the tool and thinking, I'm going to use that tool. And, you know, a lot of animals and humans use tools, but perhaps the bigger side of intelligence is storing the tool for future use, right? That's something that, you know, sometimes teenagers have a trouble grasping in terms of okay, putting the things away for future use. Now, so presumably at some point in human evolution, we saw the inevitable that someday we're going to die. And that had to come as a bit of a shock to the system. And some people have argued, some philosophers and anthropologists have argued that this ability to look into the future, this is something I agree with, might have co-evolved with the origins of religions or folk beliefs or folk religions as a way to cope with this newly developed cognitive ability to inevitably see that we're ephemeral.
So and that will lead us to the conclusion that, for instance, the idea of God might be an idea of a human idea, an idea from our minds, our brains. Oh, sorry. That would lead us to the question that this could lead us to the idea that God is a human creation. The idea of God is a human creation, in your opinion, I suppose.
Yeah. So, yeah, absolutely. I would think, in my opinion, that the universality of religion in the absence of any real evidence for those is an indication that our religious beliefs come from within, not from the outside. So I think many philosophers and scientists take that view that beliefs in, I should probably say supernatural. Religion often means connotation of something that's an organized social activity. So early on, these were belief in the supernatural, but many people take that view that supernatural beliefs were evolutionarily adaptive, and that we evolved to have those for some evolutionary reason.
Let me go back a bit. You also mentioned that our brain as a time machine, we have this subjective perspective of time. Our perspective of time could be very elastic, I would say. So we can sense time as moving fast or slow, In your opinion, what will be the key element for this? It will be the attention we pay to the passage of time, or as someone mentioned this morning, also the attention we pay to our body?
There's no doubt that it's all of the above. That's crystal clear. It can be the situation in which I am, if I'm meditating or if I'm thinking, that's some internal focus. But, you know, a trivial example is if you're in pain, pain is a somatic response. If you're in a pain and somebody's pinching you, that tends to make time go by slowly. So in some sense, there's absolutely no doubt that the state of the body, the state of the mind, the social context you're in, the psychopharmacological context you're in, meaning if you're taking psychoactive drugs or other drugs, influences time. So these are absolutely no doubt that our subjective experience of time is influenced by all those factors.
Another interesting aspect of your work is that you try to explore the interactions between neuroscience and also physics, the physics of time. Do you think there is also a gap here? I mean, the time the biological time, the psychological time we experience on Earth is not the same as we see it as the time in the physics or the time in the universe. So how could we in somehow correlate these two things?
So this is an important question regarding that time means very different things. So the people, we use time to mean different things. Even in English to Portuguese, time and tempo are slightly different words because the word tempo is used in a very different context sometimes because it also means something meteorological. But the interaction between the neuroscience of time and physics of time, there's some tension there. That's true, and this is more on the debate. So this is more speculative and on the philosophical side. And in physics and philosophy, there's two views of the nature of time, the physical natures of time. And one is what we call presentism. And in presentism, only the present is real. The past was real, the future will be real, but it's undetermined. The counter view is called eternalism or the block universe. And in the block universe, the past, present, and future are equally real. The semantics here gets a bit, you have to be careful because language wasn't made to talk about four-dimensional time. So under that context, the notion is that we're in an arbitrary point. So the idea is now is to time as here is to space. We all acknowledge here is just one point in space. There's other points in space. So under eternalism, there's other points in time, other moments in time that are equally real. Now, so one way to distinguish this is under presentism, the concept of time travel, physical time travel, is absolutely impossible. So you can't have time travel under presentism. Under eternalism, you can talk about it because it's a theoretical possibility. Now, where does neuroscience come in? Neuroscience comes in the sense that we all perceive subjectively that the present is fundamentally different from the past and future, right? Everybody here has to acknowledge that because we feel that we've lost opportunities to interfere with the past. That's gone. It's in our memories. And the future is yet to be made. So the question is why in physics there's a slight preference for eternalism. What I and others have argued is that we should take the brain evolved to understand a universe governed by the laws of physics. We evolved, we were selected to evolve under those circumstances. To do that, we need to understand intuitively understand the laws of physics at the mesoscale level. We don't need to understand the laws of physics at the quantum mechanical level or the cosmological level, which is why our intuitions are horrible, right? Our intuitions of cosmological level physics and quantum mechanical level physics are absolutely horrible. But our intuitions of mesoscale physics, of the world and we're interacting with it, which is mostly Newtonian physics, are actually quite good. And if they weren't, we wouldn't be alive. And time is at the mesoscale. So our argument is that because time is at the mesoscale, our subjective experience of the passage of time are probably accurate. And in the absence of evidence from physics towards eternalism, or presentism, which is there no empirical evidence either way that we should favor presentism and trust the brain's subjective experiences in that regard.
Jimena, do you want to add anything about this gap between different times?
Sure. I mean, I guess what it's a very, very, very useful way to divide the physics into such camps. I guess an interesting thing is to point out what do we lose by dividing into two camps, or why do we divide it in two camps? So, for example, what's lost intellectually in having these bifurcated subjective or objective notion. So why, for example, can you get lost and arrive at a supermarket and not your house, but you never get lost and arrive last Tuesday, right? So these questions about the unique dimension of time in physics and how they actually fit or not fit with subjective time, and how subjective time is also tied to, understood by reference to similar machines, is a bit of a reflection of our historical and cultural moment, impasse. And I was very struck at your main talk, how you talk about the brain as a timer, but not the brain as a clockmaker.
Yeah, I think I sort of meant a bit of both. It's certainly a timer. The words timer and clock, I think sometimes we use ambiguously and imprecisely. Right. Maybe that's the problem.
No, but it's focused on sort of lower level temporal activities. Most of neuroscience most of the valid experiments in neuroscience. And what happens if we really think about the brain, also the brain of the scientist, the brain as the person who is creating these tools through which we're understanding our own subjectivity. These objective tools don't come out of nowhere. They've been made by us for certain purposes. So that makes it a little bit of we're not coming from nowhere understanding the brain as a neuroscience, but the neuroscientist, which is I'm more interested in studying scientists than nature. The neuroscientist itself. How does it?
That makes you a neuroscientist. Yeah.
Yes. How has it come to this?
I will go there.
Yes. Okay.
No, please.
Yes. No, that's
yes. About precisely, you study. You like to study scientists.
Yes.
And you you study what happened between Einstein and Henry Bergson, and that huge clash they have in 1992. So. About this was a dispute between a physicist and a philosopher. So could you take us there to that moment, to that place, to that debate, and tell us a bit what happened?
Sure. And it was just 2 days, 100 days ago. So what happened is that Einstein went to Paris to give a lecture on April 6, 1922, and sitting at the audience of the Société Française de Philosophie was the philosopher who was known for his theory of time, Henri Bergson, and who is now a lot less known than Einstein. And they had a discussion in which Bergson spoke about half an hour, and then Einstein just responded, and it isn't clear how well he understood French, but he just responded. He said, "The time of the philosophers does not exist." And it represents the moment in which the sort of baton of who gets to speak about science shifted from philosophy. And previously it was theology and the humanities, and poets could all have something to say about real time. But that, since Einstein shifted to Stephen Hawking's and mostly scientists in the physical sciences, but neuroscientists on their heels, but still the most successful books about time, I think, are still by cosmologists and physicists, and the general public searches for those rather than neuroscience. But it represents this division, which I think has marked the century of between subjective and objective time,
Exactly.
and that we're, there's so many paradox and unresolved questions that perhaps a way out is involves expanding what we consider to be good experiments, good neuroscience.
And are we still experiencing the echoes of that clash between physics and philosophy today?
Definitely. I think, this conference was very much an exception by bringing in all disciplines so many different disciplines to talk to each other. But the most prominent voices in the field of physics, although they acknowledge that there are philosophical underpinnings to what they do, there's still a very, very fixed hierarchy. Stephen Hawking has given some of the comments that philosophy is dead. Stephen Weinberg, Richard Feynman, that philosophy is as useful to the scientist as ornithology is to birds. And they're very frequently, as when you step back and look at it as a larger historical cultural system, you see scientists employ philosophical concepts that are not examined or acknowledged, but are implicit.
What would you respond to those provocative?
Well, I think that we need to think about the creation of instruments more carefully, because when technology occupies like a no role, it's still not thought of as how does it enter, where did we get it, who gets it, who uses it, how is it tied to entertainment industry, to defense industry, to consumer electronics, and how those things then impact the theories of the mind that we end up adopting. So thinking more carefully about the role of the creation of technology and the brain as a cultural machine as well. So culture is a huge. The brain is a time machine, but culture is perhaps still the most powerful time machine that there is in regulating social relations. Everything from eating at the right time, which is a social activity and a ritual, as well as marking the calendars, vacations, rest, health. So,
from the point of view of scientific rules, I think Einstein might have won the battle.
Yes, absolutely.
But in your talk, you say that there is a trouble with Einstein's time, and the trouble is that what you just mentioned, or is there a?
That's the trouble. I think the trouble is the legacy of this divided discourse, and the different radically different hierarchies amongst disciplines, the disappearance of culture and the disappearance of the scientist as the inventor, somebody that needs to be put in the picture as well. So we need knowledge, obviously, but I think we also need knowledge about knowledge to have a most robust system across cultures and disciplines.
So you are fascinated about scientists and also about time. So how do you bond together those two?
Good question. Well, I think there is a sense of in which a big looking at history in really big terms. The shift from a culture that was regulated by religion to a scientific culture, and time, how it went from one to the other, and some similar problems persisted. So the church as the big cultural timekeeper, the ringing of the bells, to these instruments that can measure nanoseconds or neural synapses. But there's a lot in science. Our scientific culture, the rise of our scientific culture, has to come with a mystery And it's no longer the mystery of God, but it's the mystery of time.
Oh. So that's why we are so fascinated in the Western society, at least with time, measure time.
I think so.
So I don't know if you want to comment, any comment from what you heard from each other?
Yeah, I think what touched me most was this postulate that the humanities and the natural sciences should come together again. Because my feeling is that many of the very difficult conundra that the natural sciences fight with in the moment, like the explanation of time, or the explanation of consciousness, or the explanation of the nature of feelings, we tend to believe that we can get at answers for these questions by simply exploring our brains, because our brains are the ones that brought forth those constructs, so they try to understand this. But I think we do neglect very much that once biological evolution had brought forth organisms of sufficient complexity with cognitive abilities like ours, we started to create a new surface, a layer of reality that is an immaterial reality, that is full of concepts, full of terms for something that we can experience together, because we both experience that there's some phenomenon that we now came to call consciousness, or a phenomenon that we came to call time, or a phenomenon that we came to name God, or whatever. And these entities have been created by us following biological evolution as soon as we started to sit around fireplace and eat together. Discover that the respective other is greedy or generous, and so we had shared experiences for immaterial realities. We gave them names. Now they are ontologically different from neurons, no problem, and nobody would doubt that. So if we try to stay in the descriptive systems that describes neurons and interactions and nonlinear dynamics, we will never ever be able to explain the one, or to have a continuous naturalistic account of these various layers of reality. So I think we better be a little bit more humble as natural scientists, take the humanities more seriously, and consider the fact that what they brought forth in their description systems is not stupid. They have spent a lot of time in making the taxonomy proper and sorting out terms, and so we should begin to talk to them seriously, and they should also take us serious, because usually they don't take us very seriously, because they think that what we work with little bricks, and we are the engineers, so? And they have the great ideas. No. We should be humble on both sides and respect each other, and try to come at grips with this phase transition from phenomena that obviously we have brought into the world. Our animal brothers and sisters, they don't worry about time or about consciousness. They have it, and they work with it. Our problems come from this naming stuff. And it's nice to do philosophy and to juggle with these names and concepts in data-free space. So we should really try to come together humbly and try to solve that problem. And I think without an evolutionary approach and taking seriously that there was biological evolution and there was cultural evolution, and that we created stuff like the content of a belief system that erects cathedrals and sends people to war. These are very mighty concepts, but we won't get at their explanation by looking at individual brains alone. That's okay. Sorry, that was too long.
No, it's okay. No, it was wonderful. I'm also curious about what you are all doing at your labs at this moment. What are you researching or studying, or Joseph?
So can I ask Wolf a question
first?
Oh,
yes,
though?
Go ahead.
Yeah. So do you really think animals don't worry about time?
Now, I think they don't worry about the concept of time.
Oh, maybe the concept.
Yeah.
They certainly worry about time.
Yes.
So, for example, a bear in the fall knows that it has to gain weight in order to hibernate over winter. It's clearly worried about time. Almost all the animals that are preparing for winter are like that.
No, I wouldn't say they ignore time or they don't have a sense of time. They do, of course. But they don't, obviously it's trivial, not engage in these metaphysical discussions.
That's right.
Exactly.
so they...
Cats, maybe.
As far as we know.
Cats, I don't know. Probably cat. But others animals, I agree, yeah.
Actually, Joseph, you said also in your talk that all the cells have the clocks, so in the sense they have clocks, but they don't need to have a brain.
That's correct. You don't need a brain to have a clock.
Circadian clock. Circadian clock.
Right. But all your cells actually are keeping track of time on an hourly basis, it turns out. So, but they're maybe not self-aware. That's the difference.
Mm-hmm.
As a historian, and I've collected, Takahashi, I've collected all sorts of clocks, just as a historian, the sand clock, the water clock, the sun clock, and one of the most interesting one tied to the book Biological Time by Pierre de Comte-Deneuve was scarring, how quickly you scar as a measure of the real biological time. And I think that's beautiful because it brings together, it's not only the biology of the skin, but also being hurt, going through war. So all these clocks have different broader significances.
Interesting. So, Joseph, want to tell us a bit about what are you researching at this moment?
So, yeah, I mean, aside from trying to further understand how these molecular clocks work, we really are now fascinated with longevity and lifespan, and whether the circadian clock really does play a role in lifespan. And I think that we have some evidence for that I presented in my talk, which is really a new idea in the aging field. There hasn't been much attention paid to time or time of day for long-term processes like aging in people. So I'd say that's one of our primary areas that we're working on is how does the clock help us live longer? Why does that happen? And why is it that you can eat a McDonald's hamburger at one day and not get fat, at one time of day and not get fat, but at the other time you'll become fat? That's the other big question we're trying to answer.
So, and what approaches are you using? Genetic approaches, drug approaches?
Yeah, so all of those. We use genetics to increase clock, circadian clocks and how strong they are, but we're also searching for drugs that will enhance our clocks. And we use behavior too. So the time that you eat, that's a very simple intervention that we can do. That is a very effective way to manipulate your clock.
So you want, in a certain way, you could become masters of our cell clocks if we were succeeded on doing that strategies. For instance, the behavior one.
Yeah, you have to have some self-control, I guess, to to be able to maintain a strict time schedule, things like that.
Question, so you've done mouse mutants where you fiddle with the clock genes. Have you ever thought of doing human mutants with the clock?
So one of the one of the good things is, we have something like 8 billion people on this planet. And so on the planet, there's a mutation for almost every gene that any scientist will want to study.
Okay.
So we have this fantastic resource, which is called, human biology. And so many genes have come that way, from just natural variation and diversity of our DNA. So yes, I thought about that a lot. And we didn't do it, but my colleagues in the field have, studied human timing disorders and discovered the genes. And the very first gene that was found by Louis Potocek at UCSF was the period 2 gene. So the first 3 genes he found, in fact, in people were the same genes that we had already found in mouse. So there's a very direct connection in at least the genetic control of our clocks.
Okay, thank you. Wolf, you are still doing research, right, in your institute, which I think it's also have an interesting story, your institute, but please tell us first what you are researching.
What I'm doing now?
Yes.
Well, we have accumulated so many phenomena over the past decades, and it just so happens that I got a little bit bored in creating yet another phenomenology, recording yet another neuron with another response field, and digging in this huge haystack. So I recently, not so recently, I always liked it, teamed up with mathematicians and theoretical physicists to make computational models, trying to understand at least some of the phenomena by implementing what we know from nature into artificial systems that we simulate. Unfortunately, we have to do this with the digital computers, which are not very appropriate to do this, because much of what is going on in the brain is analog computing. But still, we have no choice. So we started quite some time ago. I still do experiments on monkeys, so to do this haystack picking of needles. It's the daily work. But it's what the simulations that really brought us a new insights into mechanisms, because we now understand. So essentially what we do is we simulate in a bottom-up way from what we think is implemented in a certain part of the cerebral cortex. And so we add more and more ingredients of what we know from our physiology, how it learns, how the nodes behave, how they are coupled. So we put in anatomy, we put in structure, and we see whether it buys us something. And to our surprise, evolution was very good. It invented a lot of stuff that we did not understand when we look at it, because there's one puzzling thing: the communication between neurons is fraught with a time delay. At first sight, you think this is not something you would like to have in a system that is a time machine, because the delays are distance dependent. Then we see they are very variable. Some of the wires, they are very well isolated, so they conduct very quickly. They are thick. Others are very, very, very slow. And if you just see this, you can't make sense out of it. But if you start to implement it into a system, all of a sudden you discover, that's something very interesting. Let me give you a simple example. If you have two oscillators coupled mutually, and you have coupling delays, you would think you never get them synchronous. But if they are reciprocally coupled, you sometimes get them synchronous. But if you do what nature does, vary the conduction delays over a wide range, then it gets an attractive property, and it synchronizes marvelously well by introducing variability. Now, this is something which we would not have expected at all, and it just comes out from playing. And the nice thing is with this theory, people, you come on Monday with an idea of let's implement this, and on Friday they have the result. This is not like in experiments.
It's a bit magic what you described. Tell us a bit about your institute, how it was. It has a wonderful story and an inspiring story.
Yeah, it's a fairy tale. Should I? Yeah, okay.
Well, yes,
Well, but it goes well with this environment, which I think is also a sort of a fairy tale. There are two brothers living in Germany. They're twin brothers. One is left-hander. He is the more fantastic, more associative guy, and the other is the right-hander. He's the more analytical one. And they have inherited from their father at that time, very modest pharmaceutical company, very modest. And they developed it, and as seems to be usual in business, they were close to bankruptcy, and then they were again very rich, and then again, and they sold this when they were at the peak. And their father had told them, look, if you get rich one day, think about science, because if you are getting rich with pharmacy, then it's science that made you rich. So do something when you get rich. So they got rich, they sold in the right moment. And so they had decided two things. One was to support this BioNTech company that was at that time just a vision. They wanted to develop these vaccines against cancer with Ugur Sahin and Özlem Türeci. And the second idea was, let's found an institute. And so I knew one of the two because I mentored him in his boarding school, which was also my boarding school, but when I was a student, I came back and took care of him. And at that time, he was about 14 or 15, and he was in love with a girl, and the mother didn't consent, and it was a drama. And then I wrote a letter to the mother. At that time, we still wrote letters, you know, and met with the mother and said, look, this is innocent. Why do you make such a fuss? And then she gave in, and the two were happy for a while. They didn't marry, of course. And so he remembered me and said, he has an institute somewhere. He knows how to do it. And so they gave me the money and the confidence to found for them an institute, which I think is unheard of. So that's what we did.
Could you share how much money?
Yes, I can tell you, because this is another point. They said on the phone when I was in Madrid at a conference, it was my birthday, and he told me, we'll give you 100 million euros and you to make us an institute.
Okay.
Then
nice birthday.
Huh?
It's a nice birthday.
That was a nice birthday present. But then I came back and then I started to explore. I knew the budget of my institute, I knew the interest rates, and then soon people told me, you won't make it, it's not enough. So I had to come back to them. After this generous thing, say, no, it's not enough.
He gave you more.
And then they simply asked me, how much do you need? And at the time I said, 200. And they did it.
Okay. Wonderful.
So then I moved into the Max Planck Society to have governance structure and have it embedded in something reasonable. But, and then I stepped down immediately.
Thank you. So the institute, I have to say, is Institute Ernst Strungman.
Yeah, Ernst Strungman, that's the name of the father.
Dean, could you share now a bit more quickly, please?
Yeah, I like Wolf, I think I became a bit disillusioned with some of the standard techniques in neuroscience of recording from massive numbers of neurons. And I think this is incredibly useful in identifying the neurons, and we need to do that. But ultimately, to me, I think what's more important is how the activity we're recording got there. Right, so we're recording all this activity. What I feel comprises understanding is I would like to know how it got there, why it is that way. And so one approach I take to try to get to that is understand what we call the learning rules that govern the behavior of the system. Mm-hmm. Sort of like in the laws of physics, what governs the celestial bodies, the learning rules, what governs which neurons are connected to each other, why they fire. And one approach we take to that is sort of a mesoscale or intermediary approach. Instead of studying molecules or animals, we study tissue. So cortical cultures, and we try to study brain in a dish type approaches to understand, at this mesoscale, the learning rules that govern neural circuits and the behavior.
Thank you. Jimena?
I'm still interested in studying scientists, and, but I've become interested in how scientists have dealt with things that don't exist, that don't exist yet, that they're the things that they're looking for, and in particular I've focused on how they use the word demon for something that breaks their theory. That bends a law of nature, that is an exception, that is not covered by their current framework. And the good thing is that scientists themselves use that word, and there are a couple of well-known demons in science.
For instance?
Like Maxwell's demon is a demon that's known by every physicist. Lesser known are Laplace's demon. Laplace's demon is an intelligence that can know where every particle is and knows the laws of motion, so he can calculate the future, the present, and the past. And there's a whole B.B. Descartes' demon. It's a demon that takes over your sense impressions and puts in another reality, and he's still very useful for brain in the bat experiments and virtual reality. So we tend to think about scientists working with real stuff, but I think to really understand the development of science and technology in a longer time period, say how we went from Descartes' automata to lines of artificial intelligence, lines of code, or from the steam engine to the microchip, it's necessary to understand what's bedeviling them and how are they looking for things that don't yet exist, but they have a hunch that they might be found someday, and they do work to find them, changing the world in the process. Yeah.
Okay, thank you.
So are you interested in the role of technology in driving science? Because like in biology and in physics, obviously, it's enabling technology. There's so many things that we can do that only exist because of inventions.
Yes, I'm interested in the back and forth. So you know, a standard way would be to say that the science of today is the technology of the future, as if science drives technology, but it's more complicated. There's also technology driving science. So the back and forth and how scientific ideas then get made in real-life laboratory experiments, and that sometimes this is driven by a search for something that doesn't yet exist.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so in my lifetime, DNA sequencing technology, completely revolutionized what we can do. It took, cost $3 billion to get the first genome, the Human Genome Project. Today, we can do it for under $1,000. It's amazing. And that literally is in 20 years that happened.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. Same with us.
Yeah.
When I started, there were no computers. We had to do cross correlations by hand. Nothing of what we do now could we do.
No.
Nothing.
Now let's go move to a more personal note. We have been discussing time with several layers of time in psychology, neurology, biology, physics. But you all must have a very personal idea of what time means for you, what is time for you. I am asking this because I am, of course, journalist, and journalists like these sound bites and these wonderful quotes. So, what is time for you, Joseph?
Ironically, I'm very bad at keeping my own time. So Carla, my wife, would say I'm a space cadet. I can't, remember any of my appointments. I have to have somebody tell me what time it is. So I'm very undisciplined with my personal time.
Okay, so go ahead, please. Sure.
Well, when I gave my talk, I started with the citation of Augustine. That I think I know what time is, but if you ask me what I wouldn't really know. And I share your problem. I used to be always 20 minutes late for unknown reasons. But somebody told, there was a talk saying that autistic people and so don't connect well to time. I heard something this morning, so there may be this problem here.
So Dean and
I don't have a good quote, but a personal quote, but I'll just give you my favorite quote about time, which is, "Time is an illusion, lunchtime doubly so." That's Douglas Adams.
Jimena, do you have one?
Well, I mean, what's changed my thinking about time, and surprisingly technology as well, is becoming apparent. But it's not just seeing my son grow up so quickly. Is seeing technology change as he grows up and as he becomes more of a master of technology and surpasses and uses new things. So just I see him every day, so I don't notice the changes in his face. I look at a photograph, and 6 months ago he was a different human being, and I feel that it's similar with technology, that it passes through our eyes in a way that's similar to growing up.
Actually, for children, they really struggle with the grasp of the passage of time. Why is that?
Yeah.
Why children, young children? I don't know who wants to. Dean, I'm looking to you, but please.
Children develops, I think, as Jenny would have been. I'm in Jenny's place, and this would have been a good question for Jenny. Jenny would have answered that. But going back all the way to Piaget, it's been well characterized that developmentally, when you ask what time is it, or how far something is, or how long did that last, children hit that maybe around 7. Even for Jenny's studies, I wonder, I would have had to ask her, when you ask them how long did that last, they confuse long with distance. So developmentally, it's well established that understanding of time, conceptualization of time, takes more than conceptualization of space, which is one of the reasons I alluded to earlier, which is time is complicated, and that's true for children and the brain. And of course, telling time is hell, right? It's like we developed clocks that have modular math and that go up to 12 for some reason, that just to complicate children's life. So that's one of the things they...
No, and so we're noticing how different it is, because many of them don't longer know how to read
analog clock,
the analog clock, and it's just the digital. So it very quickly points to a generational, a cultural, a reading that takes place that needs to be taught, needs to be nurtured.
Okay,
Thank you, Dean. Now I know why I can't deal with time.
You haven't developed it. You haven't developed it. Some people develop late, Joe.
So you still have time. We also have some previously questions from the symposium participants, and I will read one, and then I will open the discussion to the audience. So one of the questions is, do you have knowledge of research results on perception of time in altered states of consciousness during romantic passion and or sexual relationships? If not, who wants to theorize about it? So
That looks like Dean.
Well, I have one episodic report which I... very early on in my scientific career, we had to work with LSD to find out what it had effects on the monkeys. And one Sunday, I took one out of the fridge and tried it myself. Probably miscalculated the dosage because I just made it proportional to kilograms. And there was a very interesting phenomenon of dilation of time, which I sensed from the change of movement. There was a moment in this psychotic episode where all outer motion appeared extremely slow. I saw the whole world in slow motion, but only visually, because auditory sense was apparently unaltered, because the cars would still squeeze the tires, and the noise of the waterfall was still as usual, but the water fell down like honey. Extremely dangerous situation, because you underestimate the moment of hitting something. Completely unexplainable for me, but maybe somebody in the audience of those specialists who work with all the states of consciousness can give interpretation of this complete misperception of motion, which must be a misperception of time. Yeah. It's possible. This is only I can say. I don't know how it works.
No one? Okay, thank you. So now we'll take some questions from the audience. So, please.
Indeed, very fruitful to hear your remarks. A few things came to my mind. The first one is the remark that we would need an infinite dimensional space to understand the brain. You know, in physics we deal with infinite all the time. It's quantum field theory and you're doing calculations with infinity. This is not really a problem. My question is, do you really need that? When you do a task, a particular task, do you use infinite number of errors? No. So it's not, being infinite, being large is not quite a problem, right?
Yeah.
The problem is how to pose the problem. I think
but it need not be infinite dimensional, but it needs very high dimensional. Yeah. Otherwise, you couldn't store that amount of information in this system.
My other point was about what was mentioned about culture. This is, to my mind, is very important. For instance, Dean said, well, we have a very good intuition of Newtonian mechanics. Well, there is one point about culture named learning, which is so important that, for instance, every physicist learns how to have an intuition about what's extremely small and very large by doing calculations. At some point, you have a feeling about it, even though it's inaccessible to our senses. So education and culture is it's a hugely important dimension, and that I think you should take this embracing of all cultures very, very seriously, because that's, to my mind, is the only way to go really forward in science and evolving as a society as a whole.
It's more a comment than a question.
Yeah, I'll just finish, but I totally agree with you, Orfeo. You know, humans, as I was saying, humans are not that smart as individuals. You get a monkey and a human baby and put them in the forest, you know, the monkey will probably do better. You know, our intelligence comes from culture and interaction and social transmission, absolutely. Now, regarding, you know, our intuition of Newtonian mechanics, absolutely, that's culture. But I think it still has limits, and I still think quantum mechanics is one of those limits. You know, we've had a field called interpretation of quantum mechanics for 100 years. So that might be, yeah, that might be a flat line there. I don't know.
More questions?
But, sorry.
Sorry, you want to comment?
Yes.
So please go ahead.
Just take to the question of culture and about animals having a concept of time or not. So as you say, many of these things are, the squirrels do it because of evolutionary, but also what about a squirrel that wasn't raised properly, that didn't have a mother, that was a bird that was taken from the nest? Would those still follow the temporal?
I can't speak for all cases, but yes, in many cases, yes, because it's an innate, and you know, our dogs might have grown up just with adult humans and buried and still bury things. So in many cases, yeah, but of course that's modulated by learning. I wouldn't assume how well they do it or how often. So,
it's a question.
Okay, thank you. So please.
I'm remaining to the clocks, and I think the endocrinological system in women is full of clocks. And I remember now that it's as well very important for our laws, I think, because we heard from a lot of American women, they nearly can't undergo a normal birth. So the babies and the women is obliged to something what is against your body and your clocks. And they come to Europe to have a baby. It is true. And I'm very grateful for your participation here. And I think the culture and the female scientists are very, very important because we can't always measure. And everything what you told till these days have a very, very practical approach, and we don't see it really here. And then numbers, statistics. I'm a therapist. And if I had your the results of Mr. Singer, I would have been even more perfect therapist because I was treating stroke patients. And what you told here is, for me, it's nothing strange. This is my work. This is a package of a good therapist. When someone has a stroke and some therapist is not trained in this science, neuroscience, then
thank you. Thank you so much. Thank you. I don't know if someone else wants to add a question, and then yes, please.
Hello. Is it working? Yes. Actually, I have two questions that are quite different than the ones that people have been asking. So the first one would be about this concept that was presented about symmetry of time. So my question is it, and I would like to know what your opinion is, because I think there's no answer to it, but is it reality that is time asymmetrical, or is it that human beings' perception is time asymmetrical? Because we're still debating if time is a fundamental or element property. And I really think that if we consider that time asymmetry is something about human beings' perception, maybe there are other possibilities to reality that we are not considering. And this opens space for maybe some quantum questions that we're actually asking today.
And the
I
second?
don't know if I would ask my second question or...
Yes, please.
Okay. Then my second question that has something to do about this. I'm a doctor, so I'm interested in health and general health and mental health. So my question is, if the brain is this computational machine that has a higher dimensional way of operating that we cannot perceive, if there are people that have different cognitive abilities, and if there are people that can be more intuitive to these quantum physics laws, how would these people appear to you? Would they seem crazy? Would they be labeled as mentally ill? Or are these people just people who have a different perception ability that we are not used to think about as general human beings?
Okay, thank you. I don't know who wants to wants to comment, please. Dean, thank you.
The first question, I think you're referring to the physics of time in time, so in terms of asymmetry. I mean, the physics is pretty clear-cut there, and that's why we have something called the arrow of time. So in physics, there's no doubt that it's asymmetric. There's talk and there's speculation, but the standard laws as they're currently known and currently taught, and because of the arrow of time, and I think Dan and Orfeo talked about this in terms of the entropy, the entropic arrow of time, but there's many other arrows of time, but they're asymmetric. So that's pretty clear in standard physics. We can talk about potential speculation, but that's a different. But physics is pretty clear on this. Yeah, and I'll let Wolf answer the second question.
Well, I think I simply can't answer it. And I don't even have strong opinions. I tend to favor the application of Occam's razor, and just think, as had already been cited when we were here, that assertions that are extraordinary require very, very robust evidence, and one has to invest all effort to make controls that are against your hypothesis. And then, if something comes out that is statistically significant, yeah, I'm inclined to believe it, but not the other way around.
Okay, last question there.
Picking up this idea about what Dr. Singer said about no synchronicity with the studies, I wonder if maybe there's an equilibrium in this random waves of the points that in computerizing patterns that when you do the research, we see how time is related with this with time and space related with the formation of, for example, a thought. And I wonder if this random situation could be a path, making a pattern, taking that slide about chaos, and after finding a certain pattern, could create an habit in a human. So thinking about brain, and that with time would take us to create a character. So my question is, with all this, we know that robots, they can't think. There's not sentient robots. So, but with time, since time, we're looking for time, the concept of time, not the concept of God now. So I wonder if with time, this could take that mysterious, that enigmatic factor to give the robot that. I don't know if I could explain my.
Well, I could perhaps say something about the relation between dynamics and creativity, if you like, if this was what you were alluding to. I think we believe that the brain works in a range close to criticality. So if it goes much beyond its more excitability, it will fall into a chaotic regime, or it will become epileptic, which is also a boring state because everything is synchronous. Now, if you have a system that is in that working range, what can happen is that small perturbations can cause the trajectory going into a new attractor space, or two things that have been unrelated before all of a sudden fuse. And this could be the basis of a good idea, of a heureka, of a creative moment, for which we're always waiting. So this is something you can get with nonlinear dynamics, which you don't get with linear dynamics, or
Thank you. I have one last question, and then, as scientist, how do you see your role as communicating science not only among scientists but to the public?
Yeah, very important.
No, but as scientists, you should not. Do you think you should communicate not only among peers but also to the public? Yeah. How do you see you doing? How do you see your role?
We are obliged to do it. Okay. I mean, this is essential. We are paid with taxpayers' money, and we have to explain what we do. And you see now in this pandemic crisis how important it was that we have at least a minimum education in science in the public at large to make people understand why, for example, a vaccine is a good thing and not an implanted chip by somebody. So, yeah, science education is a must for us. We are paid for it.
Yeah, I think in the U.S. it's a crisis because there's such an anti-science movement and sentiment. It's become a political issue, which I think wasn't the case before certain entities. And so it's even more important for us to be able to communicate to the public. The other problem I think that we have, at least in the U.S., less maybe in Europe, is that scientists are not especially respected members of the population in the U.S. It would be professional sports players, actors. Those are the role models for Americans, unfortunately, philosophically. At least in Europe, before philosophers, writers, and artists were still important role models. I don't know if that's changed more recently. Huh? But it's not been the case in the U.S. for a very long time, and I think that's another reason it's very important for scientists to try to communicate more broadly with the public.
I agree with both Wolf and Joe. I work for the University of California, Los Angeles, and I'm a public servant. I get paid by the taxpayers. It's my job to educate. Not only do I think that's important, I think the future of humanity depends on it, as we've seen with the anti-vaccination movement. We're literally talking about life and death on short term. Climate change is a bit longer term, but the lack of understanding of the science is a serious factor. And it's complicated. It's not easy. And we're overwhelmed in the digital world with information, which the human brain didn't evolve to do. So the only thing I would add to that is that perhaps to me, one of the most important things to educate people about is about neuroscience, because we're educating them about themselves. Because if they understand their brains, then maybe they have the better tools to understand everything else.
Okay. Jimena?
No, absolutely, and alluding also to something that Wolf said, that the education should go both ways, and humanists should be educated in science, and it's very damaging to, at a very early age, start specializing breaking out the fields, and it's not only trust in science, but it's a general division of our everyday life between the art, science, the humanities, the reasonable and the unreasonable, that I think needs to be mended, and it's not just by it's a very difficult problem. I think that having Anthony Fauci be a celebrity scientist, which merges, as you said, the cult of the actor with the scientist doesn't totally solve the problem.
Okay, thank you. Jimena, Dean,
thank you.
Wolf, Joseph, it was a pleasure. You were wonderful.
Thank you.
Thank you. So thank you all. Thank you to BIAL Foundation, and have a nice, wonderful day.